You may know today by several different names. Most likely you know today as being Super Bowl Sunday, or perhaps Groundhog's Day. And in lieu of the candles that you were holding at the start of Mass, you may have remembered today being called one of the following: Candlemas, the feast of the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or as the feast of the presentation of our Lord in the temple. But no matter what name you recall today being, as a matter of fact, the Super Bowl is the only one that is entirely secular in nature. That being said, I am sure that some of you must doubt there being any kind of religious aspect to Groundhog's Day. But in fact, the tradition of Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, was a custom that was started in Germany. In Germany, instead of looking to see if a groundhog saw its shadow on this day or not, the Germans looked to see if the bear saw his shadow, specifically on the Feast of Candlemas, to determine if he would go back into his cave to hibernate for 6 more weeks or not. And while I am sure that most of us are looking forward to spring, today the liturgy asks you to look back, specifically to 40 days ago, when 40 days to go today, we celebrated the birth of our Lord in the cave of Bethlehem. 40, of course, is a very significant number, both biblically and liturgically. The 40 days of Lent, 40 days from Easter Sunday until Ascension Thursday, and traditionally, the 40 days for the Christmas season. Although currently the Christmas season technically ended a few weeks ago with the baptism of our Lord. But regardless of whether you connect today with the Christmas season or not, today's feast does unmistakably connect, continue, and conclude several Christmas themes. Namely, first and foremost, today's feast emphasizes and continues the theme of light. On Christmas Day, our eyes were drawn to the light shining in the darkness, to Christ, the light of the world. Light was also on prominent display on the feast of the Epiphany, where the light of the Bethlehem star revealed Christ as a light to the Gentiles. And today, on the feast of the presentation, light is literally seen once again, this time with candles, which represent Christ. And thus today you become something like the prophet Simeon, with Christ in your hands as he was presented in the temple. And so to put these 3 events together, you have the light of Christ revealed to the world, to the Gentiles, and to the Jewish nation. Several Old Testament prophets foretold that the temple's greatest glory was reserved for the day on which the Messiah would appear in its precincts, revealing himself. Today we commemorate that day, as their oracles are now fulfilled when our Lord entered his Father's house for the first time. And perhaps the light of Christ will also inspire you to re-echo those words of Simeon, which were spoken at the start of the day's Mass and in the Gospel, words which priests and religious say each night before they go to bed. Lord, now let your servant go in peace. Your word has been fulfilled. My eyes have seen the salvation which you have prepared in the sight of every people, a light to reveal you to the nations and the glory of your people Israel. And so while today's feast calls you back 40 days ago to Christmas, I will now ask you to perhaps think back still further. It'd be nice if I could say to think back 40 years ago to keep that theme of 40 rolling. But technically I need you to think back at least 50 years ago. 50 years ago to the ceremonies for the Feast of Candlemas, which are significantly different than they are today. And in speaking to that difference, one of the differences is that although we had the candles extinguished kind of at the start of Mass. Traditionally, for the Feast of Candlemas, candles would have been relit for the Gospel, and then again for the canon of the Mass. And why specifically at these moments? Because in the Liturgy of the Word, Christ is the most evident and revealed in the Gospel. And in the Liturgy of the Eucharist, once again, Christ is literally made present upon the altar in the candle of the Mass. And so do not be mistaken, it is no coincidence that at these moments in the Mass throughout the year, you'll notice the servers, the acolytes, bearing their candles to further emphasize the presence of Christ in these moments. And then following the traditional celebration of Candlemas, in addition to taking any candles home which you may have brought into the church to be blessed, you would have also have been instructed to take home with you the candle that you were holding in your hands, to replace your baptismal candle, and then have this new candle that you have received today serve as a reminder of your baptismal grace. Now, it may sound funny that I would say that the candle that you receive today is a replacement to your baptismal candle. And maybe it's even more strange to think that you'd actually use your baptismal candle after your baptism. But when you think about it, for most people, being honest, after their baptism, the baptismal candle probably is kept somewhere in a box as a keepsake. And I too would rather keep my baptismal candle as a keepsake as opposed to use it throughout the year. But at baptisms, I like to often recommend that parents keep their child's baptismal candle reserved for the special events of their life, and in fact use that baptismal candle for the following events: in preparation for their first confession, for their first Holy Communion, their confirmation, their wedding day, or perhaps on their ordination day, and finally, at the end of their life, when they are anointed. And so then once they depart from this life, to have that baptismal candle burning at their funeral, and then at the funeral to let that candle burn until it finally burns itself out. In saying this, perhaps you may be thinking, if the candles that we use at church represent Christ, then it wouldn't seem right that they should ever burn out. And so in some places you may have noticed, if you've been on vacation, that instead of having votive candles in church, they may have votive lights instead, where you would insert money into a box and then press a button, and then an electric light bulb will turn on inside of a plastic votive candle. And so while such a candle never really burns out, such a thing doesn't really seem to sit right with me. Yes, there is light, but there is no real warmth. And so even though wax candles do burn out, as a matter of fact, wax candles which do burn out are entirely proper for use at Mass. And why is that? Because the Mass is a sacrifice. Christ sacrificed himself on the cross, pouring out every last drop of his precious blood out of love for us, and thus letting the wick of his life burn itself out. And so also do the candles that we use at Mass seem to sacrifice themselves as they accomplish their appointed task. Furthermore, there are symbolic aspects to the candle to consider. The wax represents pure, virginal flesh. The wick represents the soul of Christ residing within that flesh. And the flame at the top of the candle represents not only the fact that Christ is the light of the world, but as the flame burns on top, represents his divinity. And so, while there are many different themes that could be discussed on this day, to wrap them up, covering only a third of what I wish I could say, I'll conclude by leaving you with this final thought. Tradition holds that after our Lord was presented in the temple, Simeon died a very happy man. You might say that he died of joy. beautiful thought it is to behold Christ, the light of the world, just before we die. For us, perhaps, poetically, seeing Christ through the flame of our baptismal candle that burns at our deathbed, but yet ultimately, literally, seeing Christ even if no one else present in our room may see him as we draw our final breath, so that in seeing Christ as our light, coming as our shepherd to collect his sheep, we may truly re-echo those words of Simeon, "Now let your servant go in peace."